Everybody, thanks for being here. I'm going to talk. My name's Paul Frields, and right now I manage the Fedora engineering team. But the main job that I did right before this was to coordinate development of the RHEL 7 product, which, as a lot of people here probably know, came out on June 10th of this year. So that was about 3.5. So we're not here to do a Red Hat celebration, but I did want to celebrate a little bit of what Fedora did in assisting RHEL. So I'm going to be talking about this mainly from a Fedora standpoint, but as somebody who has stood on both sides of that fence, which is where the title of this talk comes from. And I'm going to do this a little bit off the cuff. I know people watching on the YouTube channel or watching this video later won't see this, but I'll see if I can't get an idea from people in this room. How many people here are not employees of Red Hat? Excellent. Okay, that's about, I would say about 30, 25, maybe 30% of this room. I'm a little disappointed in that, honestly, because I really don't care what Red Hat people's reaction to this talk is. I'm really here to talk more, again, more from the Fedora perspective. I hear plenty of what Red Hat people think about it all the time, so it's awesome. It is pretty awesome. I will. I'm very proud of it. So, all right. So, without further ado, again, I'm not going to assume that everybody knows me. And again, we are doing this not just for the folks in this room, but also for a live audience at home, and later for people who are going to look at this video. So, some of this that I'm going to cover is going to be well known to the people in this room. So, bear with me as we cover some of that material. So, what I'm going to cover in this session includes a background for how RHEL development works, and I'm going to talk about things that I felt went really well during RHEL development and things that did not go so well in development. And also I'm going to have a follow-on about things that I feel need to go well for whatever the RHEL next product is. It's very sorry, there's a lot of chatter in the room and it really breaks my concentration, so if you guys could hold it down, that'd be great. Thanks. So I'm also going to talk about things that I feel are important for the trendy topic of .next, right? In Fedora, we have this habit now of .nexting everything. So I'm talking about RHEL.next, whether that's RHEL 8 or something that we can't yet conceive. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And I do want to leave a lot of time for open Q&A discussion because, frankly, my talk's going to be quite high level. I'm sure I'm not going to be covering everybody's favorite topic on what they feel went well or not well, and so we'll invite some of that commentary after the talk's done. So just a little bit about my background. Again, I was Fedora project leader from February 2008 to July 2010. I actually am very proud of the fact that I still to this date held that post longer than anybody else. So managed not to burn out for 2.5 years. So I'm challenging Matthew Miller to break my record. So for a little while, I was a RHEL operational manager. This wasn't somebody who ran like the power plant or anything or kept the lights running. It was just somebody who basically did a lot of odd job tasks. So what that means is, I had a hat like this, and it had razor blades on the outside, and I'd throw it at people and cut their ties. So I knew somebody would get the James Bond reference there. So, and then a RHEL development coordinator, which I did for about 3.5 years, followed by what I'm doing now, which is the engineering manager job, which I took over from my colleague and friend Spot Calloway. I don't know if he's around here, but all right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about RHEL misconceptions. And again, remember we're doing this for our live home audience. So one of the misconceptions about RHEL is that it is strictly on an n-year release cycle. You ask some people, they'll say 2.5, some people will say 3, some people will say 4, and it all depends on what they see as the time span between two releases, and that's changed over time. In fact, it's pretty much gotten longer each time. I don't think that necessarily means anything for the next RHEL. What really happens is that this is actually a pretty complex topic. The input for what happens for RHEL comes from a number of things. It comes from market pressures and the desire to be competitive. It comes from the needs of Red Hat's customers, the needs of our hardware partners and the roadmaps that they have. and other strategic considerations, right? And all of this goes into a big blender and funnel, which at the other end of it, we poop out a RHEL, I guess. Hopefully no one will. Hopefully this is not going to result in a pink slip for me. That I'm going to be a little bit flagrant and I don't know what's the word. I may be a little rude from here and there. So, all right. So again, going back to the RHEL misconceptions. Another one is that RHELisms are just pushed into Fedora willy-nilly in a massive conspiracy, and that we really don't care what the hell the community thinks. We're just going to do what we want. Also not true. In this case, actually, it's not a complex answer. It's actually pretty simple. We have a lot of engineers that work for Red Hat, and so whenever I hear people talking about how Red Hat does this or Red Hat thinks this, I always find that pretty interesting and actually a little hilarious, because we're made up of many engineers and we have a spectrum of opinions, and we pretty much manage that the same way you would manage any community of people trying to find consensus. So our engineers have a lot of latitude at Red Hat. I think that's one of the reasons why, for the most part, I think our engineers like working at Red Hat, because they have that latitude to go out and solve interesting problems. Oops, sorry, apologize. And they also, though, as the responsibility that goes along with that freedom, because I really truly believe those two things go hand in hand, they also bear the responsibility of bringing that integration into Fedora and RHEL. So you can't just wear, for example, a hat that is for some random upstream community and do what you want, and then RHEL has to deal with it later. Really, what we have to do, if we're really doing our jobs, is to integrate what happens in Fedora, do the hard work of working with the community to make sure that those things make sense, and that they actually meet the needs of the community and also later on the RHEL customer. And that's a rather complex task, but it's a simple answer to the conspiracy problem. There just is not one, frankly. Another misconception.
Well, there's a black helicopter outside hovering.
We're not going to talk about that right there. I know the guns are focused on me, but I'll keep it clean. Sorry, guys. So RHEL misconception number 3 is that working on RHEL is so much easier than herding cats in Fedora. After that 2.5 years as Fedora project leader, thank God I got to go work on something very straight-laced and easy. if only. It's really just a different set of herding tools and some but not all of the same cats. So it's really not that different. Okay, so another misconception is that Fedora is a beta for RHEL, and the only reason Fedora exists is to be a test bed, and everyone out there are our unwitting guinea pigs. Although this actually is also not true, and the point here is that RHEL actually has its own alpha and beta phases. We do our own testing with customers and partners, and they actually guinea pig this stuff at the alpha and the beta phases. And in fact, for RHEL 7, we had the largest ever participation from our customers and partners, which I feel was really great, because I think they were getting the ideas from Fedora that a lot of things had changed since RHEL 6, and they were interested in seeing those changes. They wanted to see the effects that happen in their infrastructure. So RHEL also has its own integrations and patches. All this stuff that happens after we branch off of Fedora, there's a lot of work that goes in internally to make things work well for our enterprise customers. Now, this doesn't mean that we accumulate all these patches and then hold them inside in a proprietary way. Of course, we're always working to push those things upstream. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of that work happens in Red Hat after we branch from Fedora. Okay, also, RHEL has its own release process, which I know well because I worked on a lot of that with my friends Ludwig Schmidt, Andre Hudlitsky, who's, I think both of those folks have been around here over the course of the conference. RHEL has its own test certification programs. The list goes on and on. So these are all things that happen by virtue of the fact that we get our early integration code from Fedora, but all of these testbed things happen completely independently of Fedora. And once we branch, things continue to happen. The rawhide continues to roll on in Fedora. Fedora releases continue to happen. So our branch point for Fedora was, it was around the time of Fedora 19, but what we took in was not exactly Fedora 19, and of course what RHEL 7 is also not Fedora 19, nor is it Fedora 20. It's kind of a combination of integrations and patches that happen from Fedora and that we've done in RHEL. All right, so here are some common conceptions. Just, I've talked about what is not the case, but I'm going to talk about what is the case. So as people know, Red Hat engineers work upstream and in the Fedora community and in their own independent communities, and they integrate that. They develop the technology upstream and then integrate it in Fedora early. At some point, RHEL branches away from Fedora. Again, like I described, we sort of pull. In this case, we pulled close to the time of Fedora 19, and then we we do testing. And fixes. These are all things that we're doing to meet our enterprise customers' needs. And like I said, that test process is happening independently, and the feedback that we get can influence some things that we do in RHEL going forward. And of course, the big kahuna is that of course RHEL has a very long, stable life cycle, 10 years and up. Certainly not the case for Fedora. We're always trying to innovate more on the leading edge, and that's one of the reasons for our short life cycle as it exists today. Okay, so what went well? So I have, I've got a few of these that we're going to talk about. One of the things that I feel went well was our feature process. The Fedora feature process helped an immense amount with understanding and spreading understanding around Red Hat, both in the engineering side, in the management side, and in the what we call the business unit or BU, which includes our product management and marketing groups. The data that we have that comes from our developers, maintainers around Fedora about what's in Fedora really helped power this joint understanding. The FPL's talking points, these things that we're able to highlight for releases, that stuff actually does get viewed and does get consumed inside Red Hat by people who are not all involved in Fedora day to day. So it helps us kind of find those early integration points that are going on, identify issues where there are either things that are not working the way that we would like by the time we get to our branch point from Fedora, places where we need to add some additional resources and get people looking at some of the tough problems and untangling those. So that kind of improvement on a short life cycle and doing it iteratively means that we don't have any surprises happening on the RHEL side, like, oh, hey, suddenly this thing suddenly landed, because we do have that very open and transparent process that's going on constantly. Another thing that went well, probably most people in here have forgotten that this actually happened because we've been living with it for so long, but between the time of RHEL 6 and the time of RHEL 7, in Red Hat, we had our conversion to disk Git. And we based that on the work that went on in Fedora to go to Git, right? And probably people here, there are some people in the room, I think, who remember when we were doing CVS in Fedora and also CVS inside Red Hat. And this was a really big bonus that we took from the fact that Fedora moved to Git. We were able to look at the results of that, the tooling that Fedora release engineering did, and sort of bring a lot of that internally for our own release and configuration management group. They provide the release engineering resources for RHEL, as well as all of the other products in the portfolio. So this has made it a lot easier inside Red Hat to manage changes, merge back and forth, make sure that the fixes that we're doing make it back to Fedora, get to the upstream. Really helped a lot. And even where we did have some issues with particular mechanics around Git, the fact is that those problems were easy to solve, and that turnaround really helped. Also, just to point out, one of the things that we were able to manage really well with Git is again encouraging our maintainers to upstream their fixes. We actually had a policy, and I'm sure there are engineers here who remember this. We actually had a policy for the way that we did our our test releases is that at specific points, we actually would pull Fedora stuff back in and pretty much clobber anything that was in their repo that was not upstreamed yet. So it was a very strong incentive to upstream those changes in Fedora, and we did that on purpose. And I know it may not have been extraordinarily popular with every Red Hat engineer, but the fact of the matter is that kept us doing the right thing. So I actually really appreciate the fact that that we managed things that way. Something else that went well is a fairly predictable schedule for Fedora. And that helped us make decisions on branching, like when we would branch. That's always a very difficult choice because there are competitive things that we're thinking about and doing inside Red Hat with our RHEL product up till fairly late in the cycle to make sure that the product's going to be as good as it can be. And so the fact that we could more or less rely on Fedora to be releasing around a certain time, even if there's a week or 2 or 3 of slip here and there, that really did help us with our planning. A side point I should make is that the gradual tightening of release criteria for Fedora over those last couple months of each release cycle also tremendously helpful. I don't know if Adam Williamson's still here. I think he may have disappeared. So really a shout out to the Fedora quality assurance team and for the engineering work that they did around those criteria. And that also helped us in the case that Fedora moved a week or 2. During those last few weeks, things are not chaotic, so it's an easy trade-off to make. So that date-driven, again, the date-driven releases, it works well. So again, trying to provide some perspective from the RHEL side. Speaking of quality. Another thing that went really, really well in Fedora as a whole over, I would say, the last probably 3 or 4 releases especially, ever since I would say about Fedora 17, the quality of the releases themselves has been getting extraordinarily good. I know that there is a perception externally, or maybe sometimes we generate this perception ourselves to try and lower the bar a little bit, that maybe Fedora is not for every man, and that somehow it's more of a bleeding edge distribution. I don't know that I really agree with that. I would say more if you leave off the B, right, because we're not B grade. It's more of a leading edge distribution, and I would say one of the most, especially over the last few releases, some of the most stable ones that I've ever used in Fedora, and I've been using them since the very beginning. And if you compare and contrast this to around the same time frame for RHEL 6, like 10, 11, 12, that really was not the case. Fedora was not at that same level of quality. So I feel this is something that the Fedora community has done extraordinarily well for the last few releases. And Fedora 20, obviously we've been on a longer schedule for that. It's been out now for 8, 9 months, 10 months, something like that, because we did elect to sort of stop the train so we could figure out with our quality team and the release engineering team how we're going to manage Fedora next. Because of that, Fedora 20, I think, also has been very, very stable. Even though we do have changes and updates coming regularly, they've been very painless, I think, and the community can attest to that. So again, a lot of these policies and criteria that we see happening in Fedora really have helped a lot on the RHEL side, because when we get to these branch points, there hasn't been a sudden storm of activity because of something lacking in the Fedora stream. Another thing that went well, openness of development plans. This is a little more meta, but frankly, the way Fedora does business makes it very, very easy for us to look at the conversations that are going on, the work that's going on. I like to think of our 2 big community conferences. One of them is very Fedora focused, and that would be Flock, the conference we're at right now, where we bring a lot of our worldwide contributors, especially from North America and the EMEA region together. Generates a lot of information and a lot of conversation, discussion, and most importantly, activity around the stuff that we're doing in Fedora and to produce the distribution. The other half of the equation, I think, is a Red Hat-driven community conference, which is also, again, 100% open. If you have not been to this conference, devconf.cz, you should definitely check it out. It's put on by my colleagues in the Red Hat Czech office in Brno. It's been every February. I assume that's going to continue. And those conferences have been just exceptional over the last few years. Huge amount of technical content. It tends to focus very heavily on the development work. So there's really less going on there about the collateral work, things like marketing, documentation, outreach, things like that. It's very heavily focused on developers and developers of open source across the ecosystem. So not just Fedora, not just Red Hat, but people from upstreams all over Europe gather there. And it's a really great conference, so I highly recommend it. And I want to thank Red Hat Czech. Also, I want to make sure that someone on camera says thanks to our friends at the Red Hat Open Source and Standards team, because they actually provide a lot of funding and a huge amount of work for this flock conference. And so without them, it would be a lot harder to do something like this. So if you, if you run into those folks in the hallway track, make sure that you lead off with "You are doing an awesome job." So the value of these conferences throughout engineering cannot be overstated. I mean, I would say that our groups are basically the biggest. We are the biggest recipients of ideas and benefits from both of these conferences. So that drum beat has gone really well. Okay, so what went less well? And this so with no slight intended to my colleagues at Red Hat, I had a really hard time identifying anything Fedora was doing badly that didn't help with RHEL. And so when we think about the things that didn't go well, in my mind, a lot of things that didn't go well are things where Red Hat sort of failed to capture something from Fedora, or failed to, I think, follow through on some things that we could have done better in an open source way. And those are, to me, are more Red Hat problems to solve than Fedora problems to solve. But I will also point out that within Red Hat, and I don't want to, again, not to be self-congratulatory, because there's a lot of people who work on RHEL all the time. But within Red Hat, I think it's fair to say that overall the RHEL 7 release was recognized as pretty much our best major release ever, and that's because of the hard work of a lot of people. So, as we go through this, do take it with a grain of salt. I may have a different point of view than some people, and hopefully this will be of interest to the wider community. One of the things that I feel did not go well is communication with Apple. Whenever we go from one major release to another, package complement changes inside the product, and there are two things that come out of that. One is there are some packages that the Apple community has worked on in a lot of cases that we want to bring into the distribution, and at the same time there are packages that we are not as interested in maintaining over a long life cycle. Maybe they've slipped out of affinity for customers, and we're not interested in them, they're not interested in them, so we move those out of the product, and that presents an opportunity for the Apple community to pick those up wherever they want. Now, this communication channel is affected by the way that we manage our products and some strategic and competitive concerns. So this is not a simple problem to solve, because it's not just a matter of, oh, well, just tell us earlier what you're putting in the product and what you're not. Obviously there are some competitive reasons why you don't necessarily want to open the kimono, early on in the process. Also, things can change fairly rapidly and up to fairly late in the process, and we do need to have flexibility for that. But at the same time, I think that's an opportunity. Maybe we could figure out how to take it a little differently than we've done previously. So this is something that I'll be discussing with the next RHEL planning team to see if there's a way that we can improve that. Second thing I feel went less well is cross-marketing of new technology. The Fedora Community Act definitely does a great job of talking about all the technologies that are in early and being integrated. Great examples are things like GNOME 3 and Systemd. Firewall D, a lot of those forefront technologies that we try and integrate early in Fedora because they're very interesting to us and they solve real problems. I feel like Red Hat did not do as much of its part as it could have, communicating about the development that we're supporting and trying to explain to the wider open source community and the wider public at large why they're important and what problems they solve and how well they solve them and what our future plans for those technologies are. I feel like we as a company could put a little more emphasis on that. And again, as I go through these, remember that what I'm kind of talking about here are not necessarily Fedora issues to solve, but something where maybe we can learn a little from the way that Fedora is doing business. And I think this is going to be very important going forward, right? We've already got some relatively controversial, but definitely attractive new technologies that are happening that Fedora and Red Hat people are involved in, like Wayland, Cockpit, and some other technologies. So I feel like we at Red Hat need to do a better job of sort of getting in front of the issues and in front of the train and sort of helping people understand how some of those technologies solve problems. So again, this is something to discuss with the folks who do our product marketing. Another thing that I feel, and I think this is my last less well issue because I don't want to drive this into the ground on a bad note, but tool upstreaming. Red Hat has obviously production tooling that we do internally to make the RHEL product, and not everything we do is necessarily a competitive advantage for our subscription model, right? There are a lot of things that we offer that make our subscription model attractive to customers, right? And it's why Red Hat is doing more and more business every month and every year. People are understanding what that subscription model means to them. But not everything that we do to build the product is necessarily of value for the subscription. So there's a lot of that tooling. It feels like we could do a better job sort of coordinating and cross-pollinating to the upstream. So, and this is something that we're actually already looking into, for example, with our release engineering team, trying to smooth the differences between how we make Fedora and how we make RHEL. With, of course, as always, our intention is to upstream that stuff as much as possible and really take what Fedora is doing and bring it internally rather than trying to reinvent the wheel internally. All right, so that was a lot about I think benefits and drawbacks, and it actually looks like we're about right on time because this is about where I wanted to be at this point. So for the future, just a couple points that I wanted to make. Again, I don't think it's possible to overstate this. Fedora helped to successfully build another major RHEL release. And while this is certainly not the only reason that Fedora exists, there are myriad other reasons. You can go to our wiki and understand what Fedora is all about and why it exists. One of the major benefits for Red Hat as a sponsor is that Fedora helps us build the next RHEL. And it did so in an extraordinary manner for RHEL 7. So thank you to the community for that. Something that we should be keeping in mind, right, especially as we're going to these conferences and thinking about Fedora Next, and as you hear people talking about Fedora Next, right, you might be tempted to think, oh, that doesn't really apply to me, or well, it's just a bunch of terminology, and really we're just going to have packages and we'll just roll them up and spin them, and that's it. Keep in mind that again, if one of the functions to help Red Hat understand and continue to want to invest in the Fedora project is its ability to help us make the next RHEL. And the next release of RHEL may not be structured or designed the same way, right? It's that we never make that assumption, right? RHEL 7, it doesn't look extraordinarily different from RHEL 6 in a structural way, and that didn't look extraordinarily different from RHEL 5 in a structural way, but we never go into the process believing that that has to be the same forevermore, right? And the next RHEL product may be, several years away, so there is time to think about and change some of those assumptions. So to make that that process work, ideas like Fedora.next and Project Atomic and RPM OS Tree and some of these technologies that we're talking about here, software collections, Docker, these technologies may become extraordinarily important for how we build the next RHEL. And as a result, people at Red Hat are going to be very interested in making those things work in Fedora, because again, we don't want to create a chasm where Fedora is sort of constructing itself one way and RHEL constructs itself an entirely different way. Because when that happens, Fedora loses some of its value to Red Hat, right? And as a person who loves Fedora, right, where I spent 10 or 11 years of my life working on Fedora, even before I worked for Red Hat, I don't want to see that happen. I want Fedora to continue to have, and in fact increase, its value to Red Hat. And I feel like Red Hat, by participating even more heavily in recent years in Fedora and coming to these conferences and so forth, is doubling down on Fedora, and I think we want to make sure that we're coming through in that way. So, again, only time will tell, but these are just possibilities I'm talking about. And so that means that we need support from and collaboration with the community now more than ever. So as we're going forward and thinking about some of these construction issues and thinking about structural issues, let's make sure that we check our assumptions at the door and hopefully bring that into our conversations. So with that, again, I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time. We had a 45-minute slot. We're 30 minutes in, so believe it or not, I'm actually on time, and I've never been able to say that before for these presentations. So that's enough for me. So now I guess I want to take some questions and open discussion from folks. I would encourage my colleagues at Red Hat, again, this is kind of our opportunity to really think, talk about some of the questions or issues that we're thinking about. Yeah, Phil.
So, coming back to the first slides that you had about Fedora being a community-driven and open upstream focus, and playing devil's advocate, not being Red Hat influenced kind of distribution, or influenced maybe, but not like no conspiracy theory. I'm going to the no conspiracy theory slide. How would you see the evolution then in Fedora, with Red Hat being a very strong contributor to Fedora, obviously, and driving a lot of the technologies there, in contrast to the community? And what would your thoughts be about what happens if Red Hat's interests conflict with those of the community in Fedora?
Yeah. So that's a good question, just in case it didn't all carry through. I think that if I can summarize the point, it's that Fedora is obviously highly influenced by the fact that we have a lot of Red Hat folks involved in it because of its value to Red Hat. And what happens when Red Hat's needs or direction comes into conflict with volunteers? And I would say, one thing I would correct in that is that Red Hat's needs don't come in conflict with the community. We are the community as well as volunteers,
yeah.
Right? But what happens when volunteers and people who are paid to do things in Fedora collide? And I would say that it is our responsibility to drive consensus and to be able to explain the value of what we're doing to Fedora as well as RHEL, right? Obviously, there is an answer to some things where we can say, well, this has great value in RHEL, and therefore we really want to do it. And that does have some value, because again, just the fact that Fedora helps us build the next RHEL is itself a value of Fedora, but it's not the only thing that's there. And so it's incumbent upon us, I think, to think about, as we're designing and making new technologies, that we also be thinking about the upstream and the wider Linux community when we're trying to build these things and integrate them. And keeping in mind that we a lot of times are trying to drive these technologies cross-distro as well. So it's not just about Fedora or RHEL in a lot of cases, it's about the wider community. And so it's incumbent upon us to build that value into the technology so that when we come out and talk about it, it's easier to make that consensus happen. And so having those discussions early and transparently, I think, is the answer. Yeah.
So I have a related question. So while I wouldn't call it a conspiracy, I do get sometimes the perception that if a feature is important to RHEL, then it gets to get into Fedora late in the release cycle, it gets to bypass all the checks in the feature process and so on, whereas for features which are not of interest to RHEL, the cycles are being enforced much more strictly. Do you think that this is just a subjective thing that the selective perception, or do you think that this really does happen?
So, so just to summarize, sometimes it feels like maybe to some people that in the feature process there is a sort of a subjective weight given to things that are important to Red Hat. I don't think it's purely subjective. I think it would be naive to say that there's not some influence there. But I think the thing to remember is that we have this concept of meritocracy, right? And a lot of people who are doing the work get to sort of drive the work to completion. So. And one of the results of that means that people who are doing a lot of development work are naturally going to get a little more leeway than folks who are maybe bringing in something that's not seen as high value to the Fedora community. It may not get the exact same amount of leeway. At the same time, though, again, I feel like it's incumbent on us, anybody who's working for Fedora full time. From Red Hat, and this includes people on my team as well as people around the entire Red Hat engineering area, that we always be thinking about those problems and make our plans early and openly. And I really feel like communication is the answer to so many of our problems.
Yeah, can I speak to this from the school perspective?
Sure, go ahead.
These are really limitations of what we can do within Fedora. The feature or change process is there for everyone to use, and it's expected that you use it. But, well, we can't really kick you out if you don't, and there is no commit review process to prevent you from adding a rebase by beta. Some people will probably tell you that it was a bad idea, and may even propose that you reject it, but the process simply is not enforced that strictly. And yes, we do have Red Hatters who are spending 99% of their time upstream, and then they decided they need to cut a release and put it into Fedora, and they don't participate in Fedora as much as it would be great. And I don't want to excuse this by meritocracy. This is not meritocracy by Edward. This is just people having too little time or not having a separate packager for Fedora, which would, I think, in many cases be fairly reasonable and desirable.
Yeah. So maybe just to summarize again, I don't know how much the camera mic is picking up. That when people are doing really great work and we might bend the rules to get it in. I think one of the things to remember is that there are always folks around the community who are doing excellent development work, and so we want to be flexible as a distribution and not get to the point where we're letting the rules get in the way of rationality or get in the way of being the leading edge distribution that we want to be.
Yeah, I mean, just one very good example where it's actually quite clear that we're not just dumping stuff into Fedora. Recently, it's I think 1.5 years in the making, is software collections. We've had discussions over the last 1-2 years with Fedora, with the FPC, with FESCO, with all other things. And for us as Red Hat, because we think it's a great technology that we would like to see also in Fedora, we did not just push it there, and it's not there. I mean, and as painful as it is for us as Red Hat, I think, this is a very good example where it's clear that we do our due diligence here as Red Hat in discussing it with Fedora, with the community, and trying to find that consensus that we're talking about.
Yeah, and so again, just for the mic, so software collections is an excellent example of this, where that discussion and a fair bit of conflict, right, has been going on now for some time to try and get software collections and understand how we can make that work with Fedora, either in or around or whatever the case may be, and that is still ongoing. I think there are a significant number of people in Red Hat who feel like this is a really great technology, and clearly the wider community has looked at it and been very appreciative of what it does and what it can offer for them, for developers, for example. It's incredibly useful. But at the same time, clearly that has not been sort of shoved into Fedora over the objections of anyone, and so that conversation does take place. And so I think again, not to harp on this too much. Maybe for every one time that maybe something is coming in late, or, try and bend the rules as a community to allow that development to come in. There's probably 99 other things that just, sail right through and happen exactly like we'd like. So, I don't think perfection is not something I want to strive for in Fedora. If we try and do that, we will slow to a crawl. So I'd rather make some mistakes along the way and get better constantly. Yeah.
I just would comment on what you were saying, Kevin, that certainly shit happens, and people are making stupid things and mistakes happens, and I can assure you, even looking from inside of Red Hat, there is no conspiracy. People do stupid things, and yes, even the people who are employed by Red Hat do a lot of stupid things, and we really need to communicate better, and conflicts are to be resolved, not to build up on them or stuff like that.
Yeah, I would also like to add that maybe this depiction that sometimes things that Red Hat wants happens versus the people who are not in Red Hat, within the Fedora community. Plenty of times you find I think it's 100% of the times you'll find some people of Fedora who have their own subject within let's say the desktop guys, right? We get to decide what goes in the desktop team, but that doesn't mean that other people at Red Hat who also contribute to Fedora agree to what we do. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more often you find conflict around several set of people, regardless of whether they work at Red Hat or not, than the whole of the Red Hat contribution base against the other sets.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, just kind of goes back to the point, and thank you for making that point, Alberto. It's as I said earlier, there's not one monolithic opinion at Red Hat. There are hundreds of them. In fact, you go to any one person at Red Hat, they probably have 2 or 3 opinions that are at the same time that are diverging. So yeah, so just something to keep in mind is that definitely this is a open source itself is a pursuit that naturally attracts diverse and opinionated people, and that reflects completely in the communities we build. It reflects in the company that we've built around it, and frankly, as maddening and insane as that can be, it will literally, it has driven me to drink many times. Most recently, just last night. Thankfully, not right before this talk, but the talk's not over yet. But yeah, as maddening as that can be, I would not want it to do things any other way. So it's one of our greatest. Just as it's a really difficult problem, it's also one of our greatest benefits. So we definitely want to live by that at Red Hat. And I'm going to take a comment from Shibendu here, and then I'm going to declare that is the last thing I want to hear from somebody who works at Red Hat. I want to hear from people who don't work from Red Hat too.
It's not a question so much as a comment. I think you should update your slide that says you're herding cats and add you're herding schizophrenic cats.
Schizophrenic. Good point. I will do that actually before I upload them.
Can we get T-shirts with that on?
Official schizophrenic cat herder. So I think we have that.
Yeah. Should anything as cats?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You never know if they agree with you or not until you open the box. So yes.
Now that Red Hat sponsors the CentOS community as well, are there any plans for some joint events like Fedora plus CentOS?
So that's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but it certainly seems like something to be very natural to do. And we've had participation over time from people who are in CentOS. And I'm sorry for the camera. Just to repeat the question. Red Hat now officially sponsors CentOS, or Red Hat is underwriting that in a similar way to how we underwrite Fedora. Obviously, CentOS is its own product, and it derives downstream from Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And I guess the question is, what is the outlook for having more CentOS involved in a conference like Flock? We're certainly open to that. I think the real point is to maybe drive some more of that discussion and drive some more of that content and see where we can find the right places to interact with the CentOS community. Absolutely, you know, are CentOS folks welcome at Flock? Absolutely, and I think the same goes for anybody in the open source community. But I think we want to make more of a concerted effort maybe to talk about where we can do better work together. But let's not forget, of course, there's EPEL out there, which is probably the single biggest point of convergence for what we do in Fedora and how we can help in the CentOS community. And in fact, if you look at what we ship in EPEL every day to people around the world, it dwarfs what we ship in Fedora. As well as we do in Fedora and as popular as it is, we easily produce at least 10 times more traffic goes through EPEL. So it's definitely a successful project, and we want to increase the other ways that we work well with CentOS. Yicky, yes.
I just wanted to add that I'm currently talking to CentOS guys to organize a joint Fedora and CentOS day on DevCloud next year.
Excellent. So again, for the camera, look to next year's devconf.cz, and we already have somebody working on bringing some CentOS content to a joint Fedora CentOS day there. So that would be great. Right. Anybody else? Questions, comments? All right. Well, I think we're
actually. I'll make one. I'm from a secondary arch, and I will say to the broad Fedora community, thank you for putting up with us secondary arches, for embracing us, helping us, and that goes to Red Hat as well. Secondary arches are not necessarily
secondary arches sometimes, they may not. It may not seem like the sexiest thing out there, but let's not. But in some cases, maybe it is, or it's just the people holding it.
Oh, did you hear that?
Yeah. But let's remember that. Let's remember that in some cases, secondary arches may not. They are not always things on the decline. And what I think is great about our secondary arch program is that we're starting to see things that are on the rise coming that way. And let's always remember that Fedora is supposed to be a place where we embrace the future. So yeah, we're really proud of the work for secondary arches, and going to continue it as time goes on, and hopefully accelerate it too. So thank you for being here.
Maybe change the name, not secondary, but call it candidate arches or whatever.
Well, again, we have ones that are on the rise, and sometimes ones that are kind of tailing it. So we've got to find some way to kind of wrap that so it sounds a little more more sexy.
Super important.
Super important. There you go.
Cute and embedded.
Innovative architecture.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Thank you guys for being here.